Hello and welcome to Tata Literature Live, the 11th annual Mumbai International Literature Festival and the first one to be completely digital, co-sponsored by Tata Steel and Tata Projects. The following session is a conversation between Martin Amis and Anil Dharker. They will be speaking about the life and literature of Martin Amis. Martin Amis is considered as one of the most influential and innovative voices of English fiction. He is best known for his novels, Money and London Fields. Anil Dharker is a writer, columnist, and film critic. He is also the founder and director of Tata Literature Live. We welcome all of you to Inside Story.
Hello, Martin.
How are you?
Good. Last time we spoke, you were in Mumbai, and now you're not.
Yeah, that was in 2017.
That's right. Yes, indeed. And since then, you've produced this monumental book, which I'm holding, The Inside Story, which has a couple of subtitles. I was struck by the kind of similarity in covers, in the style of the covers of this an experience, which is an out-and-out autobiographical work. Was that planned, or did it just happen by accident, the similarities of the covers?
Well, hardly by accident. I mean, I wrote a memoir after my father died.
Yeah.
Now is the time to take a rest, and I felt I had almost a pro bono duty to describe what it was like to be the writer's son of a writer father. And I didn't know then just how rare that was. Writer siblings are very common. They're as common as muck, compared to the two generations, which is very rare in all literatures except just and Alexander Dumas, Père et Fille. It's just a curiosity that the urge to write, which I would narrow it down to, is not strongly inherited, though it is inherited across brothers and sisters.
Right.
And I think I'm the only case in any literature in the world where father and son are the same kind of writer. Social realism, comic social realism, very much occupying the same tradition.
I wonder why that is so, because when you look at other fields, for example, an industrialist's son becomes an industrialist, a doctor's son or daughter becomes a doctor. In Bollywood, which you know well, in Bollywood, actors' children become actors. So why not writers?
I don't know. It's a curiosity, and the more I look into it, the more of a freak I feel I am, because it is really very rare in world literature at all for two generations to follow the same path.
Yeah.
Not so in other arts. And
this book, Inside Story, has on different pages different subtitles. Right in the beginning, it says Inside Story, How to Write. And when you turn the page, it says Inside Story, a novel by Martin Amis. Now, why is that? Did you want to have both, or you couldn't make up your mind, or what? So
I wanted to have How to Write on the cover, but the publishers said, and even my own daughters have said, they said, enough with the subtitles, Daddy, for crying loud. Because the subtitles tend to get you into trouble one way or the other. But I have this desire to impart another bit of information about how I want the novel to be read. And it's a novel addressed to a reader, a young reader, and all young readers want to be writers.
Right.
Uh, it's the same urge. Reader and writer was the relationship I wanted to explore, as well as all these other really tangible relationships with close friends and ex-lovers and so on.
Yeah.
So, it was just to sort of to guide the reader. It was inside information about how to write.
Yeah. So both books, Experience and Inside Story, are dedicated to Isabel Fonseca, your wife. And I suppose you realize you've been married almost 25 years now. It's 24 years now. Yeah. Now I wonder, though you have at some point called Inside Story a novelized autobiography, it is really a work of memoirs. And I wonder why you call it a novel. And I think there's a central point which I want you to dwell on. Is it a way to uh, protect the feelings of people uh, by saying, all right, part of this could be fiction, or is part of it really fiction? Because we don't know, as a reader, we don't know that at all. Where fact and fiction go, where they separate.
Where they separate.
Yes.
I couldn't have written this book unless it was in another form. I'd done the memoir, which deals with many of the same people and the same relationships, but make it challenging for me, I had to make it a novel, and that involved various. It's a great slogan of fiction is freedom, and a memoir does not confer freedom, or indeed the very close autobiographical fiction, the higher autobiography, does not give you much freedom. And even this book, I felt, denied me freedom because it was about real people. I mean, just to put this in context, writing about real people was unknown in serious literature until D.H. Lawrence at the turn of the last century. And he was hounded not only by law enforcement, not only for obscenity, as he's famous for, but also libel. And the most distinguished and successful life writer, the whole genre is known as life writing now, and it's an enormous genre. But Saul Bellow, my friend, who's
Yes.
central character in the book, is the only writer I think who's ever got anywhere with writing about real people.
Right.
Real people don't belong in novels. That a novel will take a character and then transform them in accordance with the aims of that novel, the artistic patterns of that novel. And Saul Bellow himself used to have very anxious nights before the publication of a novel, where he would, in the middle of the night, he would take the proof copy and change someone's hair color or change their career or even their gender to protect himself from libel. And I'm something of a purist when it comes to fiction, and I think that's a rather worldly consideration to be taking on as you're finishing a novel, whether you're going to get sued about it. I mean, in opposition to the life writing novel, there is the art novel, which is what I call it, for want of a better word, the traditional social realist novel, where you're making, you're dreaming up these people. You're not trying to transcribe what they like to be with. So it was, I still think it's a very unsatisfactory genre, life writing. I think it that injection from the imagination, but also the unconscious,
Yes.
which is the great arbiter of fiction, in my view.
My friend Shashi Kapoor, the Bollywood actor, you might have heard of him. He was part of the Kapoor clan and really one of the best looking actors we had. And he became a good actor towards the end of his career also. So since I was a friend of his, all the publishers wanted me to help him write his autobiography. And he refused for the simple reason that he said, if I'm honest, I'm going to hurt a lot of people. And if I'm not honest, why do I write it at all? So, and he loved to talk about all his leading ladies, and I'm using his word. He said they all wanted a poke, which is not a very genteel word, but so finally he didn't write it. We didn't do an autobiography, as told to memoirs. But your Rachel papers is supposed to be again on a real character, isn't it?
Well, I think that was my first novel, published nearly 50 years ago.
Yes.
And I think the young writer, particularly one who starts young, is forced into autobiographical fiction because he or she knows nothing else. All you know is your own world, your own experience, your own self-communion. Um, and then as you find your feet as a novelist, you expand, you do a peer group, you do a city, you do a country, you do compare one country with another. Your range and your span increases, but you come out of this solipsistic existence, which is the 22, 3-year-old person, and then you explore. And that to me is the exciting bit of fiction, is the exploration, imagination.
Yeah. At one point, when you're talking about how to write, you advise young writers to find an inner voice. But again, taking off from Rachel Papers and so on, it seems to me that the writer really needs to have an interesting life himself or herself to be able to write an interesting book, unless they have a very vivid imagination. Because if they have a boring life, what are they going to write boring books? Or is that
Well,
a simple statement?
Father's rule was if you're undistinguished and have not had an exciting life, then you have no business writing autobiographically at all. If you're a mountaineer who is also James Bond and a superhero in his spare time, then you might have an interesting book to write. But it's just the curse of life writing, is that there are no car chases, there are no shootouts, there are no temptresses in distant castles. Most lives, and particularly writers' lives, are very dull and solitary. So you have to look elsewhere for your excitement, and it has to be a kind of emotional, intellectual excitement. That's all you can aspire to. Writing fiction, in my definition, is freedom. And once you confine yourself to your own life, then there's a horrible restriction on your freedom, and you have to work around that as best you can.
Right. When you talk of Saul Bellow, you make a reference to a phrase which I find quite intriguing, which is moronic inferno. Can you expand on that? It's what is the reference to, and is that something which applies only to writers, or is it something which goes through other people's lives?
He did define it quite carefully, what the moronic inferno is, and he was obsessed by this all his writing life. He said writers are expected to have quite an organized self, one that can withstand the forces of modernity and these other forces that we barely understand, the technological, the commercial, the business forces, and political forces. But even writers, he said, are subject to the moronic inferno, which is a phrase of Wyndham Lewis's, who was this crazy anti-Semitic, but not talentless writer in the 30s. But the moronic inferno is the incoherent forces that we face every day, and incomprehensible forces that play on us, and as modernity accelerates, become more and more handled, and is inescapable. Sorbello calls it elsewhere the forces of distraction. How hard it is, Wordsworth's lines, the world is too much with us. Soon and late, we expend our forces, getting and spending. We know not who we are.
Yeah.
That solitude, that stillness that many writers believe is necessary for real creative thought, drowned out by these other forces and by politics. I mean, in the book, I talk about Israel and Amos Oz and A.B. Yehoshua. And Yehoshua said, in Israel, the world doesn't let you alone. You're being called to solidarity for various political and moral causes. And this is, in a way, you could call it flattering, but in fact, it's just an attack on your integrity and your solitude and your. So it's you against them, you the writer against the chaotic forces of the society.
Yeah, I wonder if that call would now go to Muslim writers. Hasn't happened yet, but because Islam is so reviled that Muslim writers may find that they have to defend it, defend the religion.
Well, early on in the novel, I said there are certain things that the novel can't do, and three very obvious things that they can't do. And they are dreams.
Yes.
Tell a dream, lose a reader, said Henry James. Yes. Sex, that is the controversial one. No one's written well about sex. D.H. Lawrence spent 50% of his tragically short life, 43 years, trying to write about sex, not comically, which can be done, and not plangently, as also can be done. Stendhal, in his little essayistic book on love, talks about what he gently calls the fiasco. And I know what all men know exactly what is meant by that.
Right.
And and he describes it as a tragedy, the fiasco, the male fiasco. And that's certainly what it feels like at the time. But in fact, the true genre of the fiasco is comedy. I mean, there are very strong historical reasons why we can't write about sex. We haven't yet learned how to write about sex.
Do you remember Ernest Hemingway's famous phrase, the earth moved?
Yeah, good, nice try, but I mean, it doesn't very much. We can do satirical or comical sex, or above all, failure, which is the great.
But I disagree with you, Martin, because you've shown yourself in this book. When you talk of the young Martin standing outside a telephone booth, and Phoebe is inside the booth making a call, and what transpires afterwards, you go to her apartment and so on. Now that is writing about sex without actually writing about sex. I find that very, very erotically charged, whole sequence. And I thought it was brilliantly written. And I said, you're contradicting yourself, because writing about the physical act of sex is comic, as you say. But you can write something highly erotic the way you've done.
Well, I'm delighted that one reader feels that way. But all one's impulses are deflationary. What can't be done is what Lawrence tried to do, and many others, which is to write about the ineffable qualities of sex. I mean, it is a very weird thing that the most potent force on earth, eros, the force that peoples the world, is not accessible to writers, certainly at this stage in our evolution. But there are reasons for it. I mean, why didn't Jane Austen write about sex? I always said that the only flaw in Pride and Prejudice is the absence of a 30-page sex scene between Darcy and Elizabeth towards the end of the book. But that's a sort of frivolous notion. I mean, until 1960, it was illegal to write about sex. Right. You wrote about sex, and there was the knock of the policeman on the door. Yeah. A couple of centuries of inhibition and slightly sniggering guilt about the whole process has built up all these inhibitions. And I live for the day when I read someone who can write well about the actual act. Nabokov said, as a good general rule in writing, he said,
but the Bad Sex Awards, I think, brings up wonderful examples of how not to write about it. So, by the way, Lady Chatterley's Lover was banned in India till quite recently. And if I'm not wrong, it's probably still on the prohibited list, but of course it's freely available. And
I know. And Japan.
Yeah. But it was banned in England too.
The famous Larkin stanza, which is sexual intercourse began in 1963, between the end of the Chatterley ban and the Beatles' first LP. It began in 1963, which was rather late for me. But I think the year is wrong. I think it was more like 1970. But it was, historically the case that you couldn't write about it. Nabokov said, as a general rule, caress the detail, but don't do that when you're writing about sex.
Right.
There's nothing worse than the mechanics of sex.
Right.
Well satirized in one sentence parodied and satirized by Kurt Vonnegut, whose example was, she let out a cry, half pleasure, half pain, half pleasure, brackets, how do you figure a woman, as I rammed the old Avenger home, you know. I mean, brilliant. But that's when, if you reveal anything about your own quirks,
Yes.
your polymorphous perverse, that is disastrous. And I would say dreams, sex, and religion, because they're de-universalizing.
But religion, you don't like Graham Greene, but I thought, well, Graham Greene is my favorite writer. I've read everything that he's written, and I wish I could have met him, but you don't seem to like him.
Well, I loved him when he was the first serious writer I'd ever read. And I thought he was tremendously adult and so on. Then I read him and met him and had that memorable time with him in Paris on his 80th birthday.
And you began with a slightly strange sentence.
But the trouble with it is that it becomes schematic. And you know, when you're reading Graham Greene, you know that the adulterer must be punished for adultery. That, you know, some statue is going to fall on his head, or some trite punishment.
That's like Hindi movies.
Yeah.
Yeah, or the Scarlet Woman or anything like that. Yeah. So.
Yes, and I read at some point. I read through the whole English novel when I was much younger, but I kept noticing that there was tremendous sexual yearning in those early writers. I mean, Samuel Richardson, Henry Fielding, but he rises above it. Smollett, Sterne, all the others, and it's all sublimated. And George Eliot and Dickens. There's a marvelously revealing bit where Louisa Gradgrind in Hard Times is being bullied by her father to marry a bumptious industrialist who's 3 times her age. And it's the dirtiest bit in all Victorian literature. Thomas Gradgrind says, "You seem uncertain, Louisa. You're looking out into Coketown, this industrial city, as if you're consulting the chimneys of the industrial works." And she says, "Haven't you noticed, Father, that all day the chimneys exude listless, colorless smoke, but at night, Father, fire leaps out." And Thomas Gradgrind, who's a comic utilitarian, says, "I do not see the application of that remark, Louisa." Significance of that remark. But this was Dickens's rather cartoonish attempt to suggest sexual excitement in a young woman, right. sexual anticipation.
Could you not write a novel which consisted of all these 3 things which you said cannot be written about? So you have dreams and you have sex and religion all in one book. And just prove yourself wrong completely.
It'll be a huge undertaking, and one that I couldn't look forward to. I mean, 3 impossible tasks. No, other pens must deal with that. I'm not looking for trouble when I
I found a very striking sentence in your book, it says, novels come from anxiety. Now, what do you mean? I thought novels came from imagination, but why do you say from anxiety? Anxiety about what? Is it anxiety about death, or is it anxiety about failure, or is it anxiety about money, or?
It will depend. But the necessary adjective to anxiety is silent anxiety. It's when you're worrying about something that is unconscious. You don't know you've been worrying about it. And when you discover it, what it is you've been worrying about, that is a novel. That is something that you've done a lot of work on imaginatively and subconsciously. Fiction comes from the subconscious. And I was, to give an actual example, it's not often that a review makes you readjust your thought about anything, a review of your novel, but a very perceptive woman writer, Maureen Freely, said that all my novels have these disappeared women in them, these women that somehow sort of vanish. And I realized that it had to do with this daughter I didn't know I had. I mean, I've got 3 daughters and 2 sons, but the first daughter, I wasn't aware of her until she was 19 years old. Wow. And already at Oxford. And Salman Rushdie said, that's the way to bring up children. Don't get to know they're at Oxford. It does simplify things very much.
Right. Yeah. But you do seem to be involved in your children in their upbringing, though, which is quite different from the way your father brought you up.
You'd think that would be very important, but and I've known writer fathers who've goaded their children into attempting to follow in their footsteps with disastrous results. It's vanity in the parent to recommend, have my life, do my life. It's a narcissistic ambition. Mm-hmm. My father, who was always a very sweet father, but rather absent. He was always in his study, and to get his undivided attention was a great treat and a rarity. But he knew what not to do, and that was to encourage me to be a writer. So it never came up until I published 3 novels, and then he accepted me as a sort of respectable interlocutor when it came to talking about fiction. Yeah. But never pressured me.
Right. When he read Money, I think he said, I stopped reading you because you're breaking the rules, buggering about the reader, drawing attention to himself, because you called a character Martin Amos. So, but you continue doing that. Even in the present book, you refer to yourself as Martin, not I.
Both I and Martin, yes. just to have the modulation of going from the first person to the third and back again. But in the book he was talking about and dismissing. Yes. It was more sort of postmodern, playful, and he said, no, you're breaking the rules where you suddenly, present yourself. The writer presents himself or herself to the reader undisguised. But that was a fashion of the time, postmodernism. And although it produced very few obviously successful novels, like Philip Roth, The Counter Life, John Fowles, The French Lieutenant's Woman, you know, Don DeLillo, White Noise, three masterpieces in a whole generation-long experimental push is not a very high rate of success. But it did turn out to be a dead end and onanistic in a self-defeating way. But it did have tremendous predictive power. And the world we live in now is very postmodern and has been for 2 generations. It did get something about the future. Yeah, one has to respect that.
You despair of the world we live in, especially because you've been living in the US with the Donald being the president and now denying the fact that he is not the president.
Who would have thought that America, as one very brilliant historian said, America, the greatest adventure that human beings have ever attempted, to have a society that what didn't just emerge historically as yours did, as my own did, being English, existed for at least 1,000 years. But America was an idea, and that's what distinguishes it. And what I think about Donald Trump is, who would have thought that this enormous undertaking could be so damaged and almost, who knows, destroyed by a man of such a flea weight intellectually. I mean, he doesn't exist intellectually, philosophically. He doesn't even have the grand guignol vividness of a dictator. He's too lazy to be a dictator. A natural dictator, when the COVID virus arrived, would have seized control of the whole mechanism and said, right, national effort. I think your Mr. Modi would have made and has made, assertions of control, at least. But Trump folded his arms and crossed his legs and said, you could almost hear him saying under his breath, I didn't sign on for this, This is more Andrew Cuomo. This is more of an active politician. I'm just a showman and a salesman and a cheerleader. And it's a misnomer used worldwide to say that he mismanaged the COVID contagion. He didn't manage it at all.
At all, yes.
Turned away from it.
When I hear him speak, I think my granddaughter, who's 7, has a bigger vocabulary than he does.
I know. Well, we are now, Anil, we're sitting around here in New York, humoring the president. The whole country is humoring the president and taking him by the hand and with baby steps, moving him towards the truth, which is that he lost the election. Because the word loser, as he might say, doesn't exist in his vocabulary. But there it is, and it's taking him, 2 weeks to adjust to this, and it might take him longer, and he might try something even more outrageous than he's tried already. But as you suggest, he's like a child, and like a unusually, uniquely charmless child, and malevolent child too. And the idea that 40% or 45% of Americans still think he's wonderful,
Yeah.
joy and love when they see him,
Yeah.
pray for him, and
That's really what is disturbing, I think, for all of us looking at the elections, that he still has that kind of support. And then we say, my goodness, this is the most powerful country in the world. So I think that leads to despair. But enough about Trump. Coming back to writing, uh, you were shortlisted for Times Arrow and longlisted for Yellow Dog. And London Fields, apparently there were two women judges who were very uh, anti you because your women characters were very unsympathetic. What do you think of the whole award scene? Are you bothered by it? Are you bothered by the fact that you've not won the Booker? Or are you pleased also that the Times said that you are one of the 50 most influential writers in the last half century or so? Does it matter to you? Does it matter either way?
the Booker Prize. When I was young, I thought it would simplify things very much if I won the Booker Prize. It would, because it puts you on. I saw it when my father won it. As John Banville said, it's not just the money; it's the power that you become a player in the literary world. But I very soon dismissed that. And I don't win prizes at all. The last prize I won was in 1973 in England for fiction. But I take that as encouraging, that you don't want to create a consensus as a writer of fiction, or at least not for many years. Originality, which you hope you have, as Larkin said, originality is poetry. It's not just an element of poetry. And the same goes for fiction. Originality, if you have it, and if it's the same thing as talent, then you certainly hope you have it. But it shouldn't be easy to digest. And you're not going to get all the same people saying, this is what we want,
Right.
And gently applauding. It should be a bit more difficult to take than that. Anyway, that's my rationalization for not winning any of these prizes.
Well, your friend Salman Rushdie's ex-wife or partner in her memoirs said that whenever the Nobel is announced and Salman Rushdie doesn't find his name there, he goes into a fit of rage. But you never get angry about not being considered for a
No.
prize. You're saying it's encouraging. That's a very odd thing to say.
But there are ways to turn it to make it encouraging. And anyway, I might have worried about this a lot more when I was younger, but I've long since even glanced at what the Booker shortlist is, because I know I'm not going to be on it. And I, what's the Booker Prize? The only prize on earth that has any legitimacy is the Nobel Prize, for the simple reason that it's the same group of judges, or a solid, sometimes adapting itself, but people retire, people die, people are recruited, but it's the same people. With the other prizes. It's a rotating, random
Well, there's
crew of.
no consistency, you're saying. But the Nobel didn't give it to Nabokov. They didn't give it to Graham Greene, who was then considered the greatest writer.
They,
So, and then they pick very obscure people. It's as if they set out to pick obscure people.
but I implore you to believe me that it occupies about 1% of my mind every few years. Partly because inure to disappointment, and then you shrug off the disappointment and you say, and don't give anyone the satisfaction of upsetting you. Oscar Wilde said, a bad review should spoil your breakfast, but not your lunch. That you have to have your own independence and self-belief. John Keats said or it was said of him that he was killed by a review. And I thought, come on, that's pretty feeble to be killed by a review. More painful and durable wrongs have been withstood by many people. And anything a review can do to you is contemptible. I mean, that you should worry about it.
You have a very nice thing in the book where you say, imagining dropping in on Anthony Trollope or James Joyce. Suppose we dropped in on Martin Amis, what would we see?
It's there on the first page. Welcome, exclamation mark. Come and sit by the fire. Now, what can I get you? A whiskey, common sense in this one. The Macallans, the 8-year-old or the 12-year-old. You make the reader welcome. And as I get older, I'm more and more committed to the pleasure principle, which was formulated 3.5 centuries ago by John Dryden, the poet laureate of the time, where he says the purpose of literature, he called it poesy. Poetry was what he was mainly addressing, but he meant that the novel didn't exist then, 17th century. He said is to give instruction and delight. But delight has to come first, because literature only instructs as it delights. Right. I think that has stood up very well as a definition of what writing is for.
Before I go to readers' question, just one last question. You lay a lot of importance on writing, the style, the use of the language. A lot of novelists don't. So do you think they are lesser because they don't use the language? Do you think it's the primary duty of a novelist to use language well? And the other things like plot and character and so on are subservient to
language? I think there should be room for every kind of novel, and all writers essentially and instinctively adore diversity. This is the salt of life, diversity. So I completely sympathize with the reader who is looking for plot, character, psychological insight. And actually, I have far more sympathy for that kind of writer than I do to the ones like James Joyce and others whose joy is in the use of words. I mean, that is a marvelous thing when it's done as exquisitely as Joyce does. But things like the stream of consciousness is a tremendous bore. And it's amazing that we put up with it for 20 minutes, let alone 20 years. Stream of consciousness is just a work in need of a third draft and a fourth draft. It just isn't finished. We all have a stream of consciousness. That's nothing. The great challenge is to, when you write, is to find the right tone, which sounds a simple undertaking, but can be devilishly difficult, and to be convincing. And that applies to every kind of writing, even to stream of consciousness writing.
Right.
You have to, the conviction comes from the writer knowing what he or she is doing and having complete control over the material, and discipline and structure and pattern and all the rest of it.
The only problem I find with good writing, in the sense of using language originally, is that it can't be taught. It is either it's part of you, it's innate, it's part of your genetic structure almost. It's not something you can learn. Am I right?
Well, I think convenient to separate genius and talent. Genius being God-given Nabokovian altitude of perception and articulacy. Talent being knowing what goes where and how to attract the reader's curiosity. And you can't be taught genius, nor would you want to be personal, but you can consciously improve your technique, and that's what talent really is the arrangement of the management of a novel. I mean, and you get with Joyce and with Faulkner, you get writers who are all genius and no talent.
Yeah.
They're full of inspiration, but they can't commit you to a forward-moving narrative where you care about the characters, which may sound a sort of primitive incentive, but it's actually vital, I think.
A couple of questions from readers. From the Rachel papers all the way to the Inside Story, which of your books have you disliked after reading them later, if at all?
The Rachel papers is full of unexamined cliches of feeling and thought. I was very young when I wrote it, but a writer should never collude with the prejudices of his or her time. And I found some very primitive and sexist prejudices in the Rachel papers. Not prejudice, well, lazily accepted, unexamined propositions that I'd inherited that were just present in the culture at the time. And that is a disgrace, I think, for a writer.
But if you wrote it now, would it be very different?
Would be
or you wouldn't want to write it?
The narrator is 19 years old. Yeah, I wrote it when I was 20, 21. And I thought I better do it while I remember what it's like.
Yes.
Now it's an unbridgeable chasm between me and 19. And let 19-year-olds do it, because and also that there comes this point, as my father said to me, when as you're trying to write about the modern world, you hear a voice in your head, and it's a young writer talking in your head saying, listen, it's not like that anymore. It's like this, meaning the rhythms of thought have changed. And that's why I notice with some embarrassment that 4 of my last 5 novels have been historical. Not writing about ancient Rome, but writing about 1970 or writing about 1945, or
Right.
Recent history.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another question: what does the writing process evoke now that we have had a year ravaged by a pandemic? How has house arrest changed you, and will it affect your writing?
Well, I said when it all began that writers were the least inconvenienced people on earth by the pandemic. Nothing changed because you never did anything anyway. You never did social mixing.
Yeah.
You were alone. You're quarantining all the time. But now I do think it inevitably has had an effect, although it's too early to tell exactly what it is. But a certain frustration of the social urges. I mean, what we all miss, what has disappeared, is society in the broader sense, high society, low society, and everything in between. This thing called society has withdrawn from us. And I think that has caused and will cause a mild depression in the
Now, would it
right.
affect your writing? Would you write a very, very dark novel now?
No, because you can't, with fiction. I mean, Zadie Smith has just written a little book about the virus, and very shrewdly, she wrote essays, not fiction. Norman Mailer said he wanted to begin a novel about September the 11th, 2001, on September the 12th, 2001. But he was very savvy about fiction and wrote a brilliant book, little book called The Spooky Hour. And he said, I realized, of course, on September the 13th, that it would take at least 2 or 3 years for this subject to get itself into the area of what we call silent anxiety, where you don't brood about it, but it's in your mind and bothering you. And sure enough, in 2014-15, Don DeLillo, Claire Massoud, Jay McInerney all produced novels about September the 11th. You couldn't have done that in September in 2012.
Right.
I mean 2002.
Yeah.
You have to go through your front brain into your back brain, down your spine, into your loins, and then through your heart, and that takes many months.
While researching for and writing A Rub of Time, were you disillusioned by your subjects in any way? Perhaps their inspiration for their way of life?
If I felt that happening, I would swerve away.
You would not write it, or you would change it?
I would lose the enthusiasm to write about that. Again, as you get older, you less and less attracted to the negative, and certainly no glee in detecting disillusionment in yourself. So I would abort a novel if I got that feeling from it.
Yeah. Which leads to the next question: how many unpublished and half-finished books have you got? Books you have abandoned?
Only I made several starts at this novel, and there were 20 years. And then eventually things fell into something like an acceptable order. But only one scrappy novella that I wrote when I was 28 have I ever. No, I wrote a satire about an Islamic terrorism, Islamist terrorism. And I realized something that I should have already inferred from literary history, which is you can't write about a menacing reality. And I think everyone, including 98% of Muslims, find Islamist terror very alien and not in their personal tradition at all.
Sure.
But it has to settle, and then you can begin to move out from it. But it's a very subterranean art. It's the spooky art, fiction. And you lay yourself open in whatever you do, much more than a poet does, which is sort of strange because you think of the poem as being the cri de coeur. But in fact, the fiction is not a cri de coeur, but it's a mea culpa. And look at the awful things I've thought and done.
But that's, I think, a wonderful way to end this conversation, Martin. I enjoyed talking to you. And I think we could have gone on for another hour or two talking about your writing and about literature. And may I invite you to Mumbai pretty soon for...
As soon as it's possible, I'll come. And my wife wants to come.
Right. So thank you again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed that session filled with insights and anecdotes. We still have a lot of exciting sessions coming up. Later today at 2:15, we have Book in Focus, a session on Vikram Seth's A Suitable Boy. And at 6:30, the Tata Literature Lifetime Achievement Award will be presented to our favorite, Ruskin Bond. Hope to see all of you there.